For all of those tuning in, thank you. And for all those on live on YouTube or another platform, thank you also. Today, we have a very exciting panel on European democracy and international institutions. So first off, I'd like to thank the BU Pardee School Center for the Study of Europe for sponsoring this event alongside the American Enterprise Institute. To introduce the two panelists today, we'll have Professor Vivien Schmidt, is the Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration at the Pardee School of Global Studies, and Dalibor Rohac is the Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, who focuses on European political and economic trends. So how this is going to work is I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and hopefully we'll get a good conversation. I guess my name is Zak Schneider. I'm a student at Pardee. I'm a senior. I'm at Pardee and CAS studying political science and international relations. So first off, I know that you've both have written relatively extensively on democracy and institutions and the struggle for institutional sovereignty around the world. So specifically now moving to Europe, what do you see as the manifestations and ramifications of populism, and what specific threats do you see of populist ideologies and populist mindsets, and specifically what kind of ideologies are kind of manifesting themselves at the level of political discourse? So I'll start with Vivien, and we can continue there.
I think Dalibor suggested we start with sort of current events. So I was just thinking, when we ask about the threats of populism, what's really interesting with the war in the Ukraine is that it has pushed many European populists to reverse their positions. You think in particular in the Central and Eastern European countries, Poland was always anti-Russia, but always anti-immigration. Now it's welcoming Ukrainian refugees. Hungary, always very pro-Putin and anti-immigrant, is now hedging its bets. Orban now supports the war, or sort of the war effort in favor of the Ukrainians after some hesitation, but won't send arms. So he's really playing a kind of careful game. And the propaganda in the country, where Orban controls all the media, suggests that Orban is actually defending the Ukrainians and the security of Hungarians in a way that has actually increased his support in these coming in the coming elections. In Bulgaria, many citizens are pro-Russian, and it turns out the anti-vaxxers, who are also pushed by Russian bots, etc., have turned pro-Putin. Especially because of the social media in a country with very unsavvy citizens in terms of social media. In France, Eric Zemmour on the extremes of the extreme right and to the extremes right of Marine Le Pen, but both Zemmour and Le Pen are pro-Russian, or have been, and now they've been rowing back. In Italy, Matteo Salvini, extreme right again, was also in bed with the Russians and anti-immigration, and now has fully embraced Poland and immigration for Hungarians. But he tried to go one step further and went to a small town in Poland, which was a total fiasco because the mayor there had not forgotten that Salvini had been to Poland before wearing a pro-Putin t-shirt. And so the mayor was humiliating to Salvini, saying, we don't want you here. So those are sort of a few tidbits, bits of news about what's happening in terms of populism. But I think it's important for me to define what populism is. If I've got about 5 minutes, I can do a little sort of deeper digging on what is populism. And I see it as having 4 main elements: message, messenger, medium, and milieu. So in terms of the message, we have to talk about style and content. The style is anti-elite. It's a rhetoric of us versus them, we the people versus the elites, the real people against the others. But there's also a post-truth universe with all-out assaults on expertise, unbiased facts, and assault also on the truth via the new uncivil language of politics. And the content, though, so it's important, there's a style that seems to cross all populisms, but the content of the messages can be very different given different varieties on the extremes of the right, on the extremes of the left, and in what I call the kind of basically the radical center, extremes in the center. So if it's on the left, there's a focus on socioeconomic issues, anti-capitalist, pro-social, but it tends to be more inclusionary and in favor of human rights. So it's actually more open to global solutions to problems. The extremes on the right tend to be much more focused on sociocultural issues, and they therefore tend to be exclusionary. They're anti-immigration, nationalistic, often global trade. So they're more close to they're more closed to global solutions, and in some ways more, to my mind, more of a threat to global order, given xenophobia and nationalism that precludes in Europe EU solutions. But we see this in the US in terms of trying to pull back from international trade and other things. And of course, the extremes on the center take elements of both, often in a contradictory mix. And right now, the five-star movement is mainly the only one that exists in this unstable position on the extremes of the center. But just one more thing, or actually three more things, but what makes the message appealing? And that's about the messenger. These are charismatic leaders who play on their persona, claim to embody the people, me, the people, in the words of Nadia Urbinati, but they're very different. What makes charisma? Who knows? Because Trump with his incomplete sentences, Boris Johnson in the UK with the buffoonery, plus a plummy accent, Marine Le Pen, who is now going around saying, I'm just a normal middle-aged woman who loves cats. Well, actually, she's not saying it, but the center is saying it about her. But beyond that, it's all about authenticity, which actually enables these charismatic leaders to lie or bullshit, basically, where you don't even know that they know what's the difference between lie and truth. And they still retain support because this is a leader just like them, their people. But what we could say is, and I want to put a caveat here, there's a difference between these leaders in opposition and in power. In opposition, they can conceivably be a positive force for change if established elites and parties address the problems that they are highlighting. In power, however, they can be very dangerous if they undermine the institutions of liberal democracy. If they continue to offer simplistic solutions, they try to fire the representatives of the deep state. They attack the judiciary, attack the fairness of elections if they lose them, or they make sure that they don't lose them by rigging the electoral system. And here we can mention Trump again, Orban in Hungary, Kaczynski in Poland are all illiberal Democrats, i.e. trying to pull down liberal democracy, whereas on the extreme left, you have Syriza in Greece that actually has become now a mainstream kind of social democratic opposition party. And they, whatever complaints about what they did, it's clear that they accepted the loss of elections, became parts of the loyal opposition, et cetera. So it really becomes a question of, do you respect liberal democracy or don't you? Another, very quickly now, how do they gain support? This is about the medium. It's about social media, which are key to populists. And they did it before mainstream politicians got into the act, using Facebook, Twitter, etc. And social media creates echo chambers in which post-truth messages can circulate, fake news, and it works especially for populists because anyone can post. So there's not the kind of hierarchy or control of the media that you have with the traditional media. And so this is partially an explanation for how it's managed to to spread so quickly. And then, of course, the traditional media has amplified these messages, has played into it. Tweets become the story of the day, and the media also fuel the polarization of society. Especially when you see Fox News versus, let's say MSNBC, it's a polarization that just reinforces everything. But, finally, there are good reasons why they've gained support that have to do with the economics of people feeling left behind, the problems of globalization gone too far. And here we can talk about neoliberalism and the way in which that maybe it was a way of correcting some of the problems that you saw in the post-war period by the 70s, but it's taken us way too far in the other direction with the economy seen above society. And a hollowing out of democracy, in part as a result of the way in which there's been a move to the regulatory state, et cetera. But it's not just about the economics, it's about the sociology of those worrying about loss of status, about the changing faces of the nation. And finally, and importantly, it's about politics. People feel they want to take back control because they feel they've lost control. And not only at the national level, but at the international level, where they see elites, other people making decisions. It doesn't matter for whom you vote. It's always the same decisions. As they see their paychecks get smaller and smaller, at least the paychecks may stay the same, but prices go up and up, and they can't afford anything. And this is very fertile territory for populists to use, where they say, we know what your problem is, but of course they then give non-solutions, simplistic solutions, simplistic non-solutions. And I'll stop here.
I'm going to probably repeat some of the points made by Vivien, but I think she touched on a number of important things that need to be sort of delved in a little bit more, in my opinion. She puts her finger, I think, very well on this issue of populism not really mapping neatly into specific policy positions. Rather, as she highlighted, there are various nebulous intuitions that populists tend to seize, and you see that both in the United States and also in Europe. Some of those intuitions have to do with the role of international institutions, globalism, if you will. I mean, the EU and various European policies have become points of contention, but also questions like COVID, vaccines, and also relationship with Russia. And there has been, on that subject, an interesting split between populists, including actually populists who sort of identify themselves as right-wing populists, between those who have adopted fairly hawkish views on Russia, and actually, from my perspective, have played a reasonably responsible role in responding to the current crisis, such as the Polish Law and Justice Party in government, and people like Viktor Orban, where really actually when you follow the Hungarian discussion these days, it is striking how much of a dissonance there is between Hungary's role, say, in the European Council, where it is true that Hungary has not blocked sanctions against Russia or various measures adopted by the European Union over the past 5 weeks, but the domestic propaganda actually regurgitates, sometimes word by word, Russian claims. So just yesterday, Foreign Minister Szijjártó stated that Ukraine is trying to interfere in the Hungarian election, and something that has been sort of then widely disseminated on social media. Now, populism itself is, again, can be called a thin ideology. It's probably more than just a political style, but again, doesn't map into specific policy positions necessarily. But by pitting ordinary people against self-serving or out-of-touch elites, it is conducive, from my perspective, to some sort of authoritarian inkling, if you will. I mean, if you claim to speak on behalf of the people, then there is very little reason for you to be particularly concerned with the niceties of, liberal democratic decision-making process, about judicial review, about, independence of various government institutions, about, freedom of the press. I mean, if you truly are the person who is speaking on behalf of the people, then you might be, see yourself as being legitimately placed to just make decisions for the people. And I think where push comes to shove is obviously how populists govern once they get to power. And you see examples on both sides of the Atlantic of populists in power that have not been particularly effective at either governing at large or at subverting democratic institutions. I think Paul Taggart, political scientist in the UK, has a sort of typology of different sort of populist styles once they arrive in power. Boris Johnson post Brexit, to me, is, we can talk about his policy positions, but I don't think there is a sort of imminent risk to the subversion or collapse of British democracy or democratic backsliding in the UK of the sort you see in some other places. In the Czech Republic, Andrej Babiš was prime minister for 4 years without really doing all that much to change the political landscape. In contrast, in places like Hungary and Poland, especially in Hungary, 12 years into Prime Minister Orbán's tenure, there has been an incredibly sort of deep form of incumbent entrenchment that has taken place, where it is very hard. There's an election on Sunday. It will be very hard for the opposition to compete on anything resembling a level playing field because of the gerrymandering, because of all kinds of rules related to voting and diaspora Hungarians voting, because of the media landscape, which has become completely dominated by Fidesz. And there also, should the opposition narrowly acquire a small majority, it will be very hard for it to govern, because under the new fundamental law constitution adopted in 2011 by Fidesz, there are many sort of veto points created, occupied by figures that can't be just fired by the new government. Now, I mean, the question that I think is quite interesting to explore is why populists adopt these different strategies. And I think basically that really is a function of the local conditions. I mean, in some places it is far more difficult to pursue a strategy of incumbent entrenchment than in other places. In some of my work, I looked at the cases specifically of the Czech Republic and Hungary, where you had very different levels both of political polarization. I mean, the extent to which there is sort of elite-driven polarization based on the events of 1989, 1990 still being contested in Hungary, just doesn't exist in the Czech Republic to the same extent. The constitutional order in the Czech Republic has sort of weathered previous attempts at incumbent entrenchment and has proven fairly resilient. And it's also the sort of grievance-driven politics just has much less purchase in the Czech Republic. So I think it's really important to sort of be aware of the local context. I mean, we over the past 5-6 years, we've seen a lot of literature on populism as a global phenomenon, and it's clear that there are similarities across Western liberal democracies, but just the extent to which populists operate in sort of local conditions, I think is cannot be emphasized enough. Now, how do they arrive in power? I suppose, like, when you sort of look at the literature, there are sort of two broad explanations. One is that populism is downstream of economic dislocations or sort of economic changes or economic shocks. There's a famous paper by Manuel Funke and co-authors that look at the share of far-right extremist vote in the aftermath of financial crises going back to 1870. They find that in those periods, like after 2008, you would have the share of such votes, of such vote going up. The alternative is that populism is to some extent downstream of culture, or sort of cultural change, or changes in the way we consume information. And my colleague at AI, Yuval Levin, had a nice book a few years ago on how the changing role of institutions, include from universities through media to places like U.S. Senate, away from playing a sort of formative role in shaping people into certain molds, have started to play more of a performative role, giving platforms for people to become celebrities, and that has played a part in the current political moment in the United States. As with all social phenomena, it's an incredibly complex question. Clearly, there are many things at play at the same time, and also it's worth saying that that I think there is a distinct possibility that the emphasis on populism per se over the past 6-5 years has been somewhat misplaced. That really what we are seeing is a sort of political realignment of sorts in which populism might be playing a sort of epiphenomenal role. For example, left-leaning parties in Europe have been bleeding voters for many years. If you have sort of parties or party systems that are not entirely responsive to what voters want, if there is a sort of ongoing mismatch, that creates an opening of populists of various stripes. We can sort of debate and go back and forth on the particulars. I would say that the weight really is on these different kinds of explanations would be very different in different countries. So I'll stop here. I don't want to filibuster anymore, and I look forward to how this discussion evolves.
But I can just say that I agree totally with Dalibor. I think that you said it all. I think the one thing I would just like to add is that it is about the economics, the sociology, and the political. And sort of political institutions, absolutely right to talk about sort of, in a way, it's a failure of mainstream parties to adapt to the kinds of changes. We've gone from mass parties to parties that really don't end up representing citizens in the way they used to. And so is populism an epiphenomenon or not? We'll see. But the other piece is, I think it's important to emphasize the fact that some scholars, and the bulk of scholarship focuses on the extreme right and talks about the dangers really to democracy on the extreme right, especially for Europe. If we were talking about Latin America, we'd talk about the dangers of the extreme left. But in Europe, and lots of the literature we therefore read, essentially focuses on those parties that are on the extreme right, the populist parties that are illiberal, and essentially seems to argue that all such parties, that all populists are therefore a danger to liberal democracy. Whereas what I was trying to say, and I think you agree with that, and you've given examples of that, is that that's not true. Not only on the extremes of the left, but also on the extremes of the right, that it really depends on how these leaders and their followers deal with what they're doing in power, and whether they respect free and fair elections, the independence of the judiciary, or if they don't. I think that's really important. And that, of course, that it is also about, and I think Dalibor, you're right to say, it is also about the institutions, and whether the democracies themselves, that sort of the institutional context, is robust enough and strong enough that there can be pushback. That said, I mean, Hungary, it's because Fidesz got a 2/3 majority that it was able to rewrite the constitution and essentially write itself into perpetual power, it looks like. Poland is interesting to me because it's not the same thing, despite the fact that you have a Polish, the Law and Justice Party, using the same Hungarian playbook, following Orban. But not as good. I mean, it may very well be that it's also about not just the personality, but the person, the cleverness the sort of the ability to lead in a way. I mean, Orban has been able to play the European Union so that Hungary was, so that it was Poland that was first taken to task for the kinds of assaults on liberal democracy, in contrast to Hungary. All sorts of possible reasons for why, but there's that too. So there's even interplay, not just national institutions and how strong they are, but what's happening also at the EU level, if we're talking about European. And we could add, for the United States, we were all congratulating ourselves on the fact that the deep state, in the populist terminology, was actually pushing back and maintaining things until the Capitol Hill riots. And then you begin to see, oh my God, it could have been just, it was touch and go as to what might have happened in terms of democracy. So it's, it just suggests that one doesn't know. You can't really predict. We can make generalizations. We can talk about different kinds of populists, but ultimately it's sort of empirically looking deeply into each country on this whole range of factors that we've both been talking about that makes the difference.
Yeah, so Professor Schmidt, you actually kind of were like going ahead. That was like my next question, like how specifically are these populists changing institutions and how specifically do they govern differently? So I'll present that question to Dr. Rohac, but I think what I really am curious about, and I think is really important, and then I do want to move on from populism, but what are like the levers and mechanisms that populists use and employ both in and out of power? And I think this is really the key to kind of understanding how they operate and how specifically do they undermine specifically liberal democratic ideas that are something that you write about, and this global order that I think is very valuable. So like, what are the levers and mechanisms and way that they undermine that ideology?
I suppose the question, I wonder if we really want to sort of ask that question through the prism of populism at large, because those levers, whether they have to do with policymaking or whether they have to do with incumbent entrenchment, the sort of democratic backsliding we've seen in different places, are very much sort of context dependent. I suppose that the sort of political styles tend to be similar across different countries. Elites versus ordinary people. Particulars will differ across countries, but that's basically the narrative. Avizar Tucker, who is a sort of Israeli-American Czech philosopher, had a nice book on populism a few years ago, where he really sort of alludes to this role of passions in sort of populist rhetoric and sort of populist outlooks. And I think that's one of the things that sort of sets populism apart from other political styles. But again, like how populists govern, I think is extremely context dependent. Setting aside the January 6th riot, you could make the case that by and large, the Trump administration was a fairly conventional administration. When you sort of look at the sort of legislation adopted, if you sort of filter out the rhetoric and the sort of craziness of those years, it wasn't the case that the president, in spite of being in many ways a sort of novel figure in American politics, has been transformational in shaping policies or legislation in a lasting way. And I think when you look at the sort of Republican Party today, there is a sort of vacuum and uncertainty about what those 4 years really meant and where does the party go from there. And you could again point to other examples where in the UK, what post Brexit Boris Johnson managed to do was to bring the party arguably to the left on economic matters relative to where Tories were for for many years. So those are, those are again like shifts that happen, that could have happened under non-populist leaders, if you will, as well, that are not sort of particularly, I suppose, interesting to sort of look at. But if we are really worried about the extent to which populists might be tempted by forms of democratic backsliding or incumbent entrenchment, I think it's really important to sort of look for the openings for that, whether they have to do with the way the electoral system is set up, by the sort of number of different veto points in the political system. I think Vivien quite right pointed out to the difference between Poland and Hungary over the past couple of years. In the Polish case, the Law and Justice Party, which itself is a sort of coalition of sort of smaller political forces, gained a fairly narrow majority in 2015. And although its leader, Jarosław Kaczynski, was promising to build a Budapest in Warsaw, he just didn't have the voice, the votes to do that. He just didn't have the sort of political mandate to go ahead. So what he did, unlike in Hungary, was to focus particularly on the role of courts and judicial review. And right now, really sort of constitutional review of legislation in Poland is next to non-existent. And when you sort of look at some of the recent decisions, they do fly in the face of sort of even sort of Polish legal practice, and they're unlikely to sort of to be sustained beyond PiS's mandate. It has been very difficult for the party to have, or for the government to have, the same kind of influence over the media market, Poland being a much bigger, more diverse country than Hungary. So the role of government connected businesses as advertisers, that's the main vehicle in which sort of in Hungary Fidesz controls the media market, which is that all these state-owned companies or companies that are connected to Fidesz, they spend a lot of money advertising, and once that revenue is withdrawn from media outlets, they essentially go bankrupt. So being a sort of bigger, more diverse economy, you don't really have that same kind of problem in Poland, whereas in Hungary there is not a single daily printed newspaper that would contradict the government. And especially people who are outside of Budapest being the one big city in the country, their information diet is really reduced to government-run TV and radio and local newspapers, which are in the hands of Fidesz-connected entrepreneurs. So that's a very different situation, and I'm much more bullish about the future of Poland for that reason than I am about the future of Hungary. But again, I'm not quite sure whether there has been a lot of emphasis on populism per se in recent years, and I think it might be more interesting to sort of look at the sort of specifics of these different places in which they are conducive to sort of incumbent entrenchment. I mean, the question of also sort of top-down polarization is extremely important, right? So Andrej Babiš was a populist prime minister. He even would wear a red hat like President Trump for a while. His message was, "I alone can fix it," and he lost an election. Was it this year, last year? And basically, the night of the election, recognized he lost, congratulated the new prime minister, behaved in a very civilized fashion as an opposition politician. When Russia invaded Ukraine, he sort of said, "Okay, this is a time to bridge political differences and work together." So that's a case of a country where we have a very different kind of political culture than one in which election results, like in Hungary, have been sort of contested since 2006. I mean, in 2006, Fidesz basically did not recognize the victory of the sort of center left coalition. You had big protests in Budapest, which actually involved some violence, and there's this sort of residual bitterness that really goes back to the 1990s and the sort of negotiated transition away from communism, the absence of transitional justice, whereas in the Czech Republic you had lustration measures that set aside former secret police agents away from public life. And so I think these sort of specificities do matter a lot, and they are the main source of these sorts of vulnerability. So I don't think that like Erdogan's Turkey looks like it does just because he's a populist, or Duterte's Philippines look like they do because of Duterte's populism. It's really about these sort of underlying checks and balances, rules of the game, and whether they are perceived as sort of legitimate by the broader population.
Yeah, so that's a perfect way to go on this next question that I have for both of you, specifically about legitimacy. And this is something that I know that you both have wrote about relatively extensively. And this is something that's also very important. And people don't really think about a lot about this in not just the theoretical sense that, political science would think about this, but also in the on the ground, applicable sense in, for example, what's happening now in with European institutions getting a seeming bump in legitimacy due to this like external threat. So I guess the question here that I'm specifically wondering is, and both of you have used this phrase specifically, crisis of legitimacy, and I have to start with Professor Schmidt here because this is the topic of her book, but what specifically is this crisis of legitimacy, and how has this kind of manifested into a broader phenomenon, especially given this crisis in Ukraine?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Of course, that's a great advertisement for my book entitled Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone. And in it, and sort of building on from there, I basically argue that the EU really lost legitimacy in a big way during the Eurozone crisis. So what is legitimacy? Two ways of thinking about it. One is legitimacy as governing authority. That's a very basic way of thinking about it. It's public consent to any governing body, to giving it authority. But then there's also legitimacy as governing activity. And here I talk about policy effectiveness, output legitimacy, political responsiveness, which can be called input legitimacy, and the procedural quality of government, or throughput. And on all three grounds in the Eurozone crisis, you had a major problem with legitimacy. So just very quickly, in terms of failures of performance, essentially, the EU misframed the crisis as one of public debt, as opposed to the private debt, the banks that were really the main cause. It misdiagnosed it. Therefore, if you say it's public debt, then you say, well, why did this happen? It's behavioral, they said. It's a failure to follow the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact. And therefore, they ended up with the wrong remedies, which was reinforcing the kinds of rules and numbers, meaning austerity for all, rapid fiscal consolidation for countries in trouble. And so it was Ireland and Southern Europe that got hit really hard, and the EU, sort of the whole goal was to have increasing convergence in terms of all the economies upward, and instead you had increasing divergence. At the same time that overall growth was anemic, in particular compared to the US, which is sort of an empirical demonstration that the policies simply didn't work. So a lack of output legitimacy, if you will, or performance legitimacy. And then in terms of political legitimacy or input legitimacy, which is about political participation and representation, or the elites, political elites' responsiveness to citizens' needs and desires. Well, clearly with this kind of response in terms of and outcomes in terms of performance, what we saw was basically a rise of toxic politics. This is about the rise of populism, really, which, yes, it was on a slow increase. If this is the graph, it was going like this, 5% in the 80s, 10% in the 90s. In the 2000s, it's flat, 10, 15% in the 90s, it's flat. And then from 2007, 8 on, it starts going up massively, increasing. And of course, it's not just the Eurozone crisis, it's the migration crisis, and all the rest. So you get toxic politics in the South and in the North, with very different ideas about what's wrong, with the Northern Europeans accusing the South of being lazy, the Southerners accusing the North of having no solidarity. And then, of course, it's about procedural questions as well. And here as well, the problem is that there was a lack of accountability, a lack of transparency, perceptions of a lack of fairness and treatment. And it was, from different sides, but certainly what happened was that EU member states in the Council, but the Commission, European Central Bank, they all basically recognizing that the performance was deteriorating, began changing the rules, but they did so by stealth. In other words, they increased flexibility, they recalculated the numbers, but they didn't admit it. And of course, that's also a problem for legitimacy. So the Spaniards continue to feel oppressed even while they were accommodated, and the Germans felt deceived regardless. By 2015, this got better, but the damage had been done. And then of course, by 2015, you get the immigration crisis. And then you get Brexit in 2016, and Trump's election. And all of this fuels populism, if you will. What's really interesting, though, is what happens with COVID. Because the COVID response actually changes everything. Because it has to do with output performance in terms of legitimacy, because after a brief déjà vu of the Eurozone crisis, we're going to make the sinners pay and we saints don't have to. As Northern Europeans in particular started, there was, I think, this famous episode where the Dutch finance minister basically blamed the victims, blamed the Italians for not having put money in their health systems. Well, give me a break. It was the rules that didn't allow the Italians to spend in the way that they needed to invest. On the contrary, they cut in all those areas that would provide growth, in education, in training, et cetera, didn't invest for growth, couldn't, at the same time that they cut healthcare system and all the rest. Well, what you see is that after 4 months or so, the EU does what it would not and could not do, as it turned in the Eurozone crisis. It breaks the taboo against EU level rules on debts and deficits that were solidified in the Eurozone crisis, creating the next generation EU fund, the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which is temporary, but it's a major beginning, and it provides a massive infusion of money to invest in growth for the greening of the European economy, the digitalization of society, and to address social issues, in particular inequality. And so this is where you begin to see legitimacy on the rise, the sort of public's views of the European Union improve massively, trust increases. And it actually also happens at the national level. Of course, citizens being fickle, but sort of this at least happened initially. And then later with mask mandates, with mixed messaging, et cetera, you can say that sort of some of the trust was lost, but generally speaking, this was better procedural throughput, if you will, for better performance and therefore better politics.
So I have to preface this by saying that I'm no political theorist, and I won't try to play one on this panel. So I'm sorry if sort of my response lacks some of the nuance that Vivien's response had. I spend most of my sort of time a day trying to explain Europe to people in America who find themselves somewhere on the center right. So it's funny to sort of see myself in a position of defending the European architecture in some respects, not in all, to somebody who I presume is intellectually further to the left of me. I think that it is very easy, especially on the sort of conservative center right, to oversell the idea of the EU as being fundamentally illegitimate or undemocratic. There's this sort of long debate about democratic deficit in the EU. And I just want to say one thing, that the EU does allow for both the exercise of voice and the exercise of exit, and the UK left, following its referendum in 2016, that option is open to other member states as well. And I think it's very conspicuous that that option has not been taken by other member states. I mean, the UK left after its very complicated history, right, going back to already the 1970s, where you would have many Eurosceptics on the left, incidentally, then the experience with the Maastricht Treaty and the Maastricht rebels. So after all that sort of complex history and David Cameron's attempts to renegotiate the relationship, you had a fairly narrow referendum outcome that led to the UK's departure. But there are very few on the European continent that have tried to emulate that example. And I mean, I haven't sort of investigated this in a rigorous way, but I would argue that the experience of Brexit made European populists less Eurosceptic and less sort of avidly anti-EU than they were before. That said, I certainly agree that there are some very real trade-offs when you have a project of economic and political integration between sort of competing desirable values or goals. And I think the Roderick trilemma is, I think, a very sort of useful way to think about it, that you can't at the same time have the nation state, democracy, and a deep form of international economic integration, because the third item on the list involves some agreement on common rules, regulations, etc., that do pertain to national democratic decision making. And that's something that the EU has sort of struggled in various ways over the years. At the time when European integration focused on relatively innocuous, technical, obscure questions, it wasn't in the it wasn't the subject of much interest from on the part of the public or national politicians. It is specifically at these moments when the EU and national politics clashes in various ways that these calls for retaking control do emerge. I think the other source of fairly interesting source of trade-offs, if you will, is in the EU's sort of design or some sort of meta ideology, if you will, which is really to sort of proceed with the betterment of the world and of the European continent through ever more specific articulation of rules and norms. I mean, it's almost as if we were trying to just engineer away the randomness and conflict that's pervasive in political life by sort of reducing it to sort of rules and norms. And I mean, Luc van Middelaar, who was the speechwriter for the former president of the European Council, Van Rompuy, wrote a beautiful book on this subject. And I think it is quite right that there is a sort of almost a clash of cultures when European institutions, not necessarily the Council, but rather the Commission or the Parliament, have to deal with real-time, real-world crises, something that they have been manifestly not designed very well to do. And thirdly, real questions which have to do with I mean, the EU is a very sort of sui generis organization in which it's far more than just an international organization, yet it's far less than a unitary or a federal state. And there has always been this tension since the 1950s about what European integration is for, right? Whether it is a state building project, if you will, the sort of allusion to ever closer union in the founding treaties might suggest that. When you read people like Alexandre Kojève, the firebrand French-Russian philosopher, or when you read the Ventotene Manifesto, which sort of provided justification for the European project on the progressive left, I mean, there is this sort of real ambition to bring in something qualitatively new on that would transcend old political divisions and parochial, ethnic, national interests, etc. But there is also, I think, a different way of thinking about the EU, which is that it actually is a sort of mechanism for managing the existing diversity and pluralism on the European continent. And as such, it's always going to be very unwieldy and hard to manage and sort of messy. Maybe the right parallel would be going back to the history is some form of Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire by the words of some of those contemporaries. And so that tension between these alternative views of the EU, I don't think has ever been quite resolved. And I think in practice, it led to the emergence, especially in Brussels, of something that the Italian political scientist Gian Domenico Magione called a political culture of total optimism, where much of the Brussels bubble does think of the EU as something that is supposed to usher a sort of qualitatively new form of governance, and that every possible opportunity, steps are taken to move the EU in that direction incrementally, and that involves taking on fairly risky bets, like creating a monetary union between countries that, by any account, should not be sharing a common currency, which was the bet made in the 1990s through the Maastricht Treaty. I think, I suspect, Vivien and I might sort of disagree on some of the particulars and also on the way forward. But that's just, I think, to me, less important than the sort of recognition that there are these sort of founding tensions, if you will, that the EU has to live with. And to me, the lesson of the past 10, 12 years of crises is not that the EU is fundamentally illegitimate or useless or anything of that sort. It is that European politicians, both national leaders and European institutions, have to think carefully about matching their ambitions and the sort of policy tools that they have at their disposal, and really thinking of the EU as of this rambling platform for managing our differences and coexisting and generating gains from trade and cooperation when possible, and also agreeing to disagree when inevitable. I think would ultimately generate a lot less problems going forward than the Ventotene Manifesto / Jean Monnet effort to just push the integration project in one specific direction with a sort of one-size-fits-all solutions.
Yeah, I just want to leave really quickly some time for Q&A, and then we can get back to the conversation. Professor Schmidt, if you wanted to respond to.
Yeah, Dalibor, I think I tend to agree with just about everything you've said. What I would like to sort of underline is that when I said that Europe had a crisis of legitimacy, it's of its governing activities. I think what I didn't say is that I think it is legitimate in terms of its governing authority. And what we've seen over time, slowly but surely, in policy area after policy area, it developed increasing governing authority. And until the Eurozone crisis, much of that wasn't challenged. And it's with the Eurozone crisis that we see a serious problem of legitimacy. And it's largely because of the performance, but also because of the politics and the procedures, the way in which it went about to it. But what I would like to say is what's interesting is the EU learned. Various institutional actors learned from the experiences and the problems of the Eurozone crisis. And what you saw was the Commission was ready with new solutions, that the Council actually, it was the German and the Franco-German partnership that was back in play as the French convinced the Germans that, no, this is a symmetrical crisis, not an asymmetric one. We need to do something. This is about the interdependence of European economies and our solidarity. And that's when you get this sort of, what I would see as a big leap forward for the EU. I think that's tremendously important. Something else you said, Danny Roderick's trilemma is very good. And of course, the problem is what he saw as hyper-globalization, but also for the EU, hyper-Europeanization. So you're absolutely right to say that there has been the problem of one size fits all. What I see in terms of this sort of the institutional imbalances are two. One is it's a kind of split level democracy where politics still goes on at the national level and policy is increasingly at the EU level. And that what one needs to recognize is to try to find some way to bring more politics in, citizens in, basically to the EU level. And the Conference on the Future of Europe is part of that, but also to allow the national level more say. And what's interesting with the with the shift in COVID, with the resilience and recovery plan, is the European semester, which is essentially oversight over national economies, was flipped. So instead of continuing to be a sort of a top-down, you have to watch your deficits and debts, otherwise you're in trouble, it became a much more positive, bottom-up, tell me where you need, here are some of the issues we see, say the Commission, but tell us where you think you need to invest and in these specific target areas. And so it's much more bottom-up. The problem is it needs to be more decentralized and more democratized. It shouldn't just be national capitals to the Commission and the Council. It needs to be much more local and regional so that you have more decentralization, democratization on that at the national level, at the same time that we see more democratization, if you will, at the EU level. Now, this might mean actually empowering the European Parliament more, finding ways to give it more voice, at the same time recognizing that, of course, there are serious issues in the EU that have to do with, you still are going to have leadership. This is what I call a region state or a regional state, as opposed to a supranational or sort of a federal state, as Ventotene and others want. And it's one in which I see that one needs more EU at the same time that one needs more national. So you need to continue recognizing the importance of nationhood and the way in which the nation states will continue to exist. And one needs to reinforce that at the same time. We recognize that they've all pooled sovereignty. And at the EU level, you need more EU to do the things that the member states can't do as this regional entity. And that means more investment at the EU level to do what the member states, investment together to confront all the crises, as in migration, which will continue to be an issue, as in climate change, which is a massive problem collectively for the EU. So it's do more at the EU level, but also allow more breathing space at the national level. I mean, in many ways, the EU is more integrated in some policy areas than the US, that has 200 years of becoming a federal entity. So, basically, in some ways, we need to say to the EU, back off a bit, at the same time that we need to tell it, yeah, but in certain areas, you need to step up. You need to find some more EU level debt, especially if we're going to confront, if we have the Ukraine crisis and the kind of security risks that have increased. But it needs to be, working together with NATO through NATO, but then perhaps EU developing its own common security and defense ability, capacity, in a way that it really doesn't have now. And all of this means more EU, but at the same time, unless you fix the problems at the national level, which have left citizens feeling completely left out, unless you bring citizens in any number of different ways, we're going to continue to have the problems of populism, is citizens vote for people who are critiquing a system that the citizens don't feel involved in, don't feel that they're getting anything out of, etc.
I want to say that I very much agree with the spirit of Vivien's last round of remarks. There was a famous paper by Alberto Alessina and his co-authors some 20 years ago on what the EU does, where the authors just asked very simple question, namely, what are the policy areas in which there is agreement on what should be done, and what are the policy areas in which there are significant cross-border externalities or sort of effects of national policies on other countries, and they sort of evaluated what the EU does do and what it doesn't do using those two metrics, and that was 20 years ago. Things have changed, but their conclusion was again that there is a mismatch between what the EU does and what it should be doing based on those two metrics. Many of the EU's founding fathers, the sort of Christian Democrats of various tribes had this notion going back to Catholic social thought of subsidiarity, right? Of sort of higher level institutions playing only a role that's subsidiary to those that are more local. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention my forthcoming book, which should be published with Edward Elgar later this year in October or September, which is called Governing the EU in an Age of Division, where I try to sort of revisit some of these ideas, and the way I tie them together is by, I suppose, pointing out that the EU is not a one thing. It's not some sort of monolithic entity, but it's in reality really a multiplicity of different integration projects running in parallel, which have been sort of bundled together under the EU's umbrella. But there isn't a sort of intrinsic reason for all of those integration projects to involve the exact same coalitions of participants. And we already are in an age where there is a lot of picking and choosing among EU member states, particularly in an area that's close to my heart, which is European defense and security, which is essentially member state driven these days, right? The permanent structured cooperation, PESCO, is essentially an institution that allows for different coalitions of member states to sort of pursue different projects that are conducive to their security interests or that leverage their strengths. So there is a European drone being developed by a group of European countries. There are different sort of procurement programs and sort of and so on done by different coalitions of countries. And I suspect that this is I think a healthy way of sort of moving the integration project forward in an age where both national politics is very often divided and polarized, and in which there also are deep differences, including very deep differences on values between different member states. So I just wanted to make this plug for my upcoming publication. I hope I didn't hijack your programming too much by doing that.
Yeah, definitely. I think this was a really great conversation, and I think it was very informative. And yeah, thank you to our panelists.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
It was my pleasure as well.